Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'm going to show you how to turn one of the Honeycomb blanks by Hobble Creek Craftsman. There's a few special tips and considerations when turning these, so let's go to the lathe and have some fun. With these 3D printed blanks, there's a few special considerations. During the casting process, it's a 3D printed honeycomb structure that's then cast in resin, and because of the casting process, having enough room in there for that resin to flow, this might be slightly off center, so you don't want to drill this straight away. We want to go ahead and true this up on the lathe. And the reason for doing that is when the pen is finished, we want to have a nice, uniform, symmetrical pattern all the way around. If this is off center or it's crooked when you drill it, your pattern will vary as you turn the blank. So we want to make sure that this is drilled nice and square, and we want this thing to be as concentric as possible. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've marked the center. You can see the inside circle there of the 3D printed core. I've marked that with a Sharpie on that end, and now I've marked that on this end as well. So I'm going to mount this up between my 60-degree drive center and then my revolving center, and we're going to true this up. The reason for using a 60-degree drive center is I don't want the 4-prong drive center in the way of my cut. The diameter of this is larger than the pen blank, and it'll get in the way, these teeth, and I don't want to hit those with my tools. So I'm going to use a 60-degree drive. It will cause the blank to slip every now and again just because there's not a lot of drive pressure, but that'll be fine. As far as the pressure with the tailstock, I want to be fairly light. I don't want to bow this or flex it. You might actually shatter it if you get too crazy on the pressure, so just snug. Snug on the quill and the locking handle here. I've already got my tool rest set up for my spindle roughing gouge. And now we're going to go ahead and true this up, and then we can get ready to drill this out as well. Safety glasses, obviously. Make sure this rotates freely. We can go ahead and turn this on. And you can see it's slightly out of center as it's spinning around. I'm going to go ahead and increase the pressure a little bit. As far as the turning speed goes, I would turn this at about 3,000 RPM. Because this lathe is fairly loud at 3,000, I'm going to bring the speed down just a little bit. But spindle roughing gouge, I've got this slightly rolled over about the 2 o'clock position. I'm going to go ahead and just ease the material off here. If the blank stops when it hits the tool, go ahead and just increase the tailstock pressure slightly. With this 60-degree cone, you don't have a lot of drive force, and it kind of bores a hole into the end there. And all we're looking to do is true up basically one end of this so we can mount it in our chuck. Okay, we're pretty close. We're true right there. We've got just an inch and a half or so of material we got to true up. All right, I'm going to do one smooth pass and try and make this perfectly flat. There's a little bit of chatter just because that blank is unsupported and it's flexing a fair amount. But we can go ahead and stop the lathe and take a look. All right, so we've revealed the nice honeycomb pattern here. It's still just a hair out of center. I'm going to remove just a little more material. The other thing too is it doesn't have to be perfectly concentric. If it's slightly off center, just a hair, you won't notice the difference in pattern, but we want to true it up as much as possible. And the other biggest thing too is making sure that this is drilled perpendicular and perfectly square down the center. All right, we're going to go ahead now. Okay, so I've got just a tiny bit of material excess here, but that's close enough that it will still have a uniform pattern and we'll be good to go ahead. We removed about a 64th, 32nd of an inch of material to true that up, and that'll give us a lot better looking pen when it's done. So go ahead and remove that. Get rid of that 60-degree cone center. And now I'm going to mount the pen blank in my 4-jaw chuck. This is a VM100 with the pin jaws. If you have the pen blank drilling jaws, you could use that as well. And now I'm going to mount the end that we trued up in the chuck. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my pen kit. So I'm going to be turning this for an EDC click pen. I'm going to get my brass tube, and I'm going to mark the overall length that I need to have this finished. So one other consideration too is the honeycomb pattern. I want this, when it's finished, to have even amounts of honeycomb on each end of the blank. So I want to try and center that up between the pattern as best I can. And I know I'll be truing off a little bit of material right here on this end. Just give you a mark. So let's say we overlay our tube onto that line. That's right about dead center of the honeycomb pattern on this end. So this is going to be our finished end that we're going to part off after we drill. And then we're going to true this end up just a touch. I'm going to bring up my tailstock for a second just to give me a little more support. Get that tool rest where I need it. Obviously do that with the lathe stopped if you're worried about it. Go ahead and true this up slightly. I'm going to use this is the nano parting tool. This is a 30-second blade. I'm going to use that to give myself a little bit of a cut, a small part there, just so I can see exactly where I need to be in case I turn away that pencil mark. Alright, just trued up the exterior there. I'm going to use my skew with the long point down just to clean up the end of the blank. Alright, I'm going to get rid of my tailstock now. I'm going to move my tool rest in and just clean up that little nub where the revolving center was. I'm going to prep that for the drill bit as well. On these blanks, I would not recommend drilling on a drill press. Drill presses have a tendency to let that bit wander a little bit. Drilling on a lathe is going to be a lot more accurate for you and guarantee that you have those nice clean pattern. I'm going to remove the revolving center, and I'll be using my keyless drill chuck. And then this kit calls for an 8mm bit. So I've got that here. You can see I've left a little dimple there just to help that brad point find the perfect center. And then I'm going to bring that up to where it's not touching, and I'm going to bring the lathe speed down. Anytime we're drilling acrylics, or drilling in general, we want to bring the speed down a little bit. Especially on acrylics and true stone. I'm at about 700 RPM here. I'm going to slowly start feeding this in. Whenever you start the drill bit, you want to slowly let it find its natural center point, because a lot of times if you force that bit in, that blank's slipping just a little bit. I'm going to bring that out. If you force the bit in on the entry cut, a lot of times it'll tend to wander and go off center, and then it'll come out the side of the blank. So you want to make sure once you start it slow. And then on acrylics especially, slow your feed rate down a little bit, because these tend to generate a lot of heat. And I want to make sure I clear that drill bit flute quite frequently. A lot of times when I'm drilling acrylic, I'll have a little spray bottle of water just to help keep the bit and the blank cool. I've had it before where I had a dull bit and it actually melted the acrylic and then fused itself to the drill bit and caused it to snap off. So whenever you're drilling, make sure you try and keep things as cool as possible and clear those chips fairly frequently. About every ½ inch of travel, I'll try and clear the chips. And now that should be deep enough to get to our mark. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up my my tool rest. And I'll get rid of the drill chuck just so I don't run my hand into the bit. Now I'm going to bump my speed back up and I'm going to part this off, and then we can go ahead and glue in our tube. So back up to about 2,000. I would be turning 3,000 if the lathe wasn't so loud. Then I'll be using my nano parting tool. And I'm going to support the blank with my opposite hand here as it comes off the lathe. That way I can catch it. There we go. So now we've got our blank nice and trimmed, and it's just a hair longer than the tube, so I won't have to barrel trim very much. That's pretty ideal. Usually if you have a lot of material left, you have to barrel trim a lot away. It just takes a little more time. So I'm going to go ahead and clear out the dust. These tubes come pre-scuffed, so I don't have to worry about doing that. But we can go ahead and glue this in. I'm going to be using Instabond Thick. If we weren't doing a real-time style video, I would be using a 2-part epoxy, give myself a little extra time and a better adhesive for a better bond. And on these blanks in particular, you don't need to back paint them. Like a lot of acrylics, these are fine without back paint. We've found that the brass tube actually helps pop the colors and brighten them up a little bit better than painting them black or anything else on the inside. So I've coated this with thick CA glue. So I'm twisting the tube as I bring it into the blank, helping to spread that glue evenly. And then on the last 1/8 of an inch or so, I'll grab a rag, press it all the way in, and then wipe away any of the excess glue. Now that that's in there, we'll go ahead and hit it with some activator. You can see, if you look at each end of the pen blank, we're nice and centered on that 3D printed core on both ends. And the other nice thing is that drill bit was perfectly nice and straight because we drilled on the lathe. So now we can go ahead and get rid of the remainder of the blank. This would be good for a Sienna or an Aero style pen. That's one of the nice things with these pen blanks, is you can get 2 out of it easily. So I'll save this for another pen kit down the road. And we can go ahead and get rid of our chuck, and we'll be putting our pen mandrel on here while that glue's setting up. So whenever I turn pens, I like to use a collet chuck, primarily because it's more accurate. The other biggest reason as well is I can shorten up the rod depending on the kit I'm using. And this one's already set, I believe, for an EDC pen. Got some glue in the tubes. I think we'll be just a little short there. So I'm going to bring the rod out just a touch. Okay, just eyeball that there for the extra bushing and the brass nut. I think we'll be good. So as far as barrel trimming goes, so I'm going to go ahead and barrel trim this here. Because I don't have a lot of material to remove, I'm going to barrel trim this in my hand. If I had to go anything more than, a 1/64 of an inch, I'd put this in a vise. It's just a little bit safer. Barrel trim until the brass tube shows on the end, nice and polished. Go ahead and take a look at that. That looks pretty good. If you need to, if the barrel trimmer rolls the brass tube over, you can grab a skew and go in there and just ream that out a little bit. All right, now that we have these barrel trimmed and we've chamfered the edges just on the ends there, we're good to go ahead and put this on the mandrel. Get your correct bushings you need for the kit you're using. Gonna bring my 60-degree cone center up. Throw on the brass nut. Tighten everything down. If the mandrel's slipping and pulling out of the collet, go ahead and just tighten up the collet a little bit. Then you'll be good to go. As far as your tailstock pressure goes, you don't want to over tighten your tailstock on the pen mandrel because it will bend it. So whenever I bring these up, I just go snug, like just barely snug on this end and lock it down. Anything tighter than that, you're going to cause premature wear of your mandrel and you'll need to replace it more often. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my tool rest. Get that as close as possible. You always want to support the tool as close to the rest in the work as possible, just to reduce chatter, and it helps with a clean cut as well. The tools I'll be using for this pen is, I'll be doing 90% of the work with the spindle roughing gouge. This will get all the bulk of the material out of the way, and then we'll sneak up on the final size and shape with my negative rake scraper or my skew. This one I modified with just a little shorty handle. For pens and rings, this is the perfect size. I found the really long handles for these smaller projects just to be a little too bulky, so I chopped this down and then finished it up. So let's go ahead and give this a spin, make sure everything clears, doesn't hit the tool rest, and then we can turn the lathe on. We're back up to our turning speed. Anything above 2,000 for pens is a good speed, preferably 3,000 if you can go that fast. And then I've got my spindle roughing gouge with the handle down and my flute about 2 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and just do some easy cuts here. We're getting good ribbons. I'm going to flip it over now to 11 o'clock and cut towards the headstock. If you're using carbide tools, make sure you take light cuts because it will be fairly aggressive on this material. Even the spindle roughing gouge is a little aggressive and gets a little grabby. I would say this blank is slightly more brittle than most of the acrylics you use. So just be a little careful with it because you are using two different plastics. We have the 3D printed core, which is one type of plastic, and then the resin that was cast into it's a little bit different. So we have dissimilar materials here, so just be a little careful with it. Be easy on it. The one downside to turning acrylics are all these little ribbons that get caught on your bushings that get in the way. My favorite thing is when the shavings get sucked into the dust collector and then they don't get caught on anything. It's kind of handy. As far as my finish profile and shape goes with this pen, I want it to be slightly convex. I want a nice gentle curve to it. I don't want to go perfectly straight-sided. You can if you want. Whatever shape you want to do is entirely up to you. I like having just a nice gentle curve to it, nothing too crazy. If you have an old toothbrush or something, that can help clear off these shavings pretty good. You want to be careful if you are grabbing the shavings off like this, because I've had it before where this corner was fairly sharp and actually cut my finger pretty good. So if you have a sharp corner there, just be careful, or just get a small bristle brush and you can clean those out. Obviously you want to make sure you're wearing a respirator or have some dust collection going whenever you're turning. Let's stop the lathe and take a look and see just what we're working with here and see how the pattern looks. Alright, so that looks pretty good. The nice thing is we've got a nice concentric pattern here. And we're not too far from the bushing, so I'm going to remove a little more material with the spindle roughing gouge, and then we'll switch over to the skew and get our final size. If you are using the carbide tools, I'd recommend the negative rake cutter on this guy. That cutter is really good, and it leaves a really smooth surface behind so you can start sanding at a higher grit. The carbides in general usually do that on acrylics. Most of the time with the carbide tools I can usually start sanding at 600 or 800 just because the finish is so good off the tool. Had to dig in there a little bit. A little bit of a catch, I wasn't paying attention. Fortunately, I had enough material there to turn that out. That's why we switched to the skew once we get close to our final size. That way, in case you have a catch, there's still material, and then if you're going to be using the skew, you don't have a catch. So once you get to that point of no return, that's when you want to switch to the skew. And I think we're right about there. So I'm going to put the spindle roughing gouge away and go ahead and get my skew. I can see my tool rest is a little bit low for this tool. So I want that cutting edge to be right at center or slightly higher to where I can raise the handle. The other thing too with this being a negative rake scraper, that burr doesn't last very long, so you will want to sharpen more often. The nice thing about this tool is it doesn't self-feed, so it's really gentle on the work, and you can focus more on the profile of what you're doing instead of just controlling the tool. A lot of times you spend all your thinking power just trying to control what the cut's doing if you're rolling beads and stuff like that, instead of being able to focus on the shape. So that's why I like these scrapers on pens and small projects like this, because I can look at my top horizon line and just focus on getting a nice smooth gentle curve. So usually what I like to do is start from the bushing and then work to the middle and then get the profile I want, and then I'll start on this end and then blend those two together. So I'm going to flip the tool over and work from the left to right now. If you're getting any chatter in your pen mandrel, see if you need to snug up your tailstock. I don't have any chatter going on right now, so we're looking pretty good. The other nice thing about a scraper like this is I have an inch of cutting edge. So the nice thing is when I'm cutting, I can cut on a certain part of the wing at any given time. So once I'm, if I start cutting on, let me draw on here. If I start cutting on this wing, and once it gets dull, I can just rotate the handle, and then I'm cutting on the center, and then once that's dull, I can rotate and cut on this bottom wing here. So that way you've got basically 3 different cutting surfaces to work with, so you don't have to go to the grinder as often. So now that I've got to the bushings on each end, I'm going to just blend the center here and get that a nice smooth curve. Alright, just a little more material I want to take away on this end. Alright, stop the lathe and take a look. Alright, so we've got a nice gentle curve here, a little more belly in the center. That looks pretty dang good. So now I'm going to go ahead and sand this. And to start that process, I'm going to sand with 400 grit. And I'll be using the Abernet sanding screens. This is my favorite abrasive paper to use. Because it is a net, it doesn't clog up and load like traditional papers do. And I can reuse these a ton of times, and they go a lot farther than regular paper. The other nice thing is I can wet sand, dry sand with these, and they just last a lot better. So I'm going to get my tool rest out of the way. We're done using tools here. This is all sandpaper and finish now. Go ahead and just clear off some of these shavings. Because we will be doing a CA coat on top of this, I just want to try and get rid of the bulk of the shavings out of the way. So turn your lathe speed back on. I'm going to drop the speed down now because we're sanding. About 1200 RPM. You could go a little slower if you need. But what I'm going to do is grab the top and bottom of the paper and then just work that back and forth. The reason I do that is I don't want the uneven pressure of my fingertips creating ridges through the piece. I want to distribute that load across a nice flat surface like the paper, and then just work this back and forth. And all we're doing is trying to smooth out the surface and get it ready for sanding and for polishing here. So right now the paper's loaded up. You can see all that white acrylic there. Check this out. All I have to do is give it a flick, and now that paper is 100% again. Traditional papers would have loaded up and they'd be trash. So these might be initially a little more expensive than a variety pack of sheet paper, but these go a lot farther. Gonna go ahead and look at that surface we've got. Just sand it laterally before we move on to our 600 grit. So turn that back on. Now I'm gonna grab my 600 grit paper. Can you grab some more paper towel? Just the whole roll. Should throw it over there. So I've got my 600 grit paper now. Same thing, once that paper's loaded, just give it a flick, and then it's basically brand new. Alright, I'm going to grab a piece of paper towel and just wipe off any dust so we can see what we're working with. And then give your blank a really good inspection. If there's any small pinholes where the resin didn't get in there or there was an air bubble, go ahead and fill those with CA right now. This one looks really good, and I've got rid of all the wavy lines and bumps and any tool marks, and so now we're ready to polish this out. For my favorite finishing process on acrylics, I like to get CA glue. What I'll do is I'll sand up to 600, I'll get some thin CA glue and do a few coats of that to fill in all the deep scratches, and that'll give us a really good surface to then polish out. So I'm going to clean off here just a little bit, try and get rid of some dust and shavings, because I don't want those getting stuck in my finish. So I'll turn the lathe on. I'm just going to wipe the bushings down, the blank down, any of these surfaces that I might bump into and get some dust on the blank. I'm just going to wipe all these off. And for the CA finish, I'm going to be using the Instabond Thin. Reason I'm going to be using thin is it'll go in and fill in all those really small scratches and get down and give me a good base layer. I'll be using the blue paper towel. Reason I use this shop paper towel is because it doesn't kick off as fast as the white paper towel does. So I'm going to fold that over and give myself a nice little pad that I can apply the CA with. And then just a few drops. Saturate the pad, and then I'm just going to go back and forth one time. Hit that with some activator. One of the biggest mistakes I see with CA finish is guys will over-activate the surface and it'll cause that CA to turn white and foam up. So give it just a quick burst, about 10 to 12 inches away, and that's all you need to do. You can see if it's dry by touching a rag against it, and if it sticks, you know it's not cured. So give it about 10-15 seconds with a little spray and you're good to go. I folded that over to a fresh side. I'm going to saturate that, and then I'm just going back and forth a couple times. And then we'll hit that with some activator. I'm going to fold this over and give myself a fresh side that hasn't been... Actually, that one's pretty dirty. I'm going to do one more coat of CA, and then we'll go ahead and polish this out. I'll show you the surface we have after just going to 600 grit and then doing a few coats of CA. It's really, you could start sanding this or polishing it out with 2000 grit now. So you can see we've got an extremely smooth surface, and now any of these little ridges I see is just the CA, and that stuff polishes very, very well. You can see we've got an extremely good surface there, so now we can go ahead and start the polishing process. So now I'm going to turn my lathe back on, bring that speed up, back up to our turning speed. And I'll be using the Micro Magic and the Scratch Free. So I'm just going to get a good amount on my paper towel. We're going to go ahead and start polishing this out. If you found that your CA was a little too wavy to be polished out with scratch free, it might help to have a 1200 grit or a 2000 grit piece of paper on hand just to level the CA out a little bit before you move on. And let's see if the scratch free is getting polished out, or is polishing out those grooves. Yep. Got a really good surface now. I'm just going to give it just one more hit with the scratch free. This is roughly 1500 grit abrasive paste. Nice thing about it is it's non-toxic, so I don't have to worry about fumes, especially if you're turning in your house. There's no fumes on this. It's all natural ingredients. Once you're done polishing with the grit, get a clean part of the paper towel and let's remove any of that compound, and then we can go on to our next grit. So Micro Magic, it's a 3-step polishing system. Get a little bit on the paper towel. We'll go ahead and polish this out. I don't want to generate too much heat that I can't keep my finger there, but I want to be able to feel some warmth. That way I know the wax is melting and it's letting the grit do the work and start tumbling across the surface and polishing it out. The biggest benefit of using this is it's dust free. The micro mesh pads you have to wet sand with, otherwise you're going to get a ton of dust. There's still a use for the micro mesh pads, but the wax is definitely more convenient and I get just as good results or better results. So alright, we're going to go ahead and hit the blue compound. This is the last step. And you can probably see the reflection you're getting off the blank. We're getting a ton of gloss. The blank's really popping now. Let's go ahead and stop the lathe and see how the finish looks. That looks great. Let's take this off the lathe and we can see. Get rid of the fingerprint marks and the wax off my fingers. And we've got a really good looking pen. So this blank is ready to go ahead and press together, and that's a finished honeycomb blank. So there's a few special considerations when turning it, but otherwise it turns just like any other acrylic, and they're really unique. There is no other pen blank on the market that's got a complete symmetrical pattern for a honeycomb. So really neat, and I hope you guys try it out and have some fun.